Abosede. Priscilla Ipadeola is a feminist African philosopher who has taught philosophy, particularly African philosophy, for almost 2 decades. She conducted her doctoral research in the areas of political philosophy and feminist philosophy. As a recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Germany, her postdoctoral research focused on African philosophy and gender studies. Her new publication is titled Feminist African Philosophy, Woman and the Politics of Difference. Her research interests include global political philosophy, African philosophy, gender studies, epistemology, and post-colonial studies. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Ipadeola. You may now share your slides and we can have a conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for inviting me, for having me here. Yes, so let's start. So this afternoon here in Germany, but this morning for where many of you are, the topic before us is challenging androcentrism, the imperative of a gender-inclusive African philosophy. Yes, so from time immemorial, African people across various societies have relied on critical thinking and philosophical reflections to make sense of their existence and confront existential challenges. However, due to the oral transmission of their thoughts, there have been controversies regarding the origin and development of their thoughts. There have been of African philosophy. These debates have had significant implications for the perception of African people's humanity, with prominent modern era philosophers and anthropologists like Kant, Hegel, Blumenbach, Arthur de Gobineau, arguing that Africans lack critical thinking ability and rationality. Although these ideas have been discredited and are no longer influential in academia, African scholars still bear the burden of disproving their inferiority due to the lingering effects of these damaging conceptualizations. The early days of African philosophy were marked by a debate among African scholars on whether there was a discipline deserving of the nomenclature African philosophy, and whether it was necessary or even possible for such a discipline to be different, that was different from philosophy as practiced in other parts of the world. Today, the controversy over the existence of African philosophy as a discipline has been put to rest, or so it seems, and it is widely recognized as a branch of human knowledge. However, it is believed to be a relatively new discipline compared to Western and Oriental philosophies. Thus, the question arises as to how to define the content of African philosophy and what makes it uniquely African. So, this has been the preoccupation of African philosophers for several decades now, resulting in the identification, definition, and critique of different branches of African philosophy, such as epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, jurisprudence, aesthetics, logic, and political philosophy. However, one aspect of African philosophy that has significantly failed to receive the needed attention is the issue and place of women in African philosophy and society. Feminine issues have not been adequately addressed, and some ideas and extracts from African thoughts serve to reinforce the maleness of African philosophy and sustain the marginalization of women. However, this presentation seeks to explore the place of women in African philosophy and in African society also, highlighting the need for a more inclusive and gender-sensitive approach to African philosophical discourse. So I move on now to women's studies in Africa. For decades, African scholars have made considerable efforts to address the place and condition of African women. While the study of African women has been approached from different angles, there is no consensus among African scholars on how similar or diverse it is compared to women's studies in other regions of the world, particularly Western women's studies. This presentation examines the arguments from two principal perspectives. This morning or this afternoon, I'll be looking at the work of Professor Oyeronke Yewumi, and I'm so humbled that she's there. So I feel so great to have her around. So of particular interest is Oyeronke Yewumi's opposition to the notion that all women across the globe are oppressed and require emancipation from subjugation and oppression. Drawing on examples from the Oyo Yoruba society, Oyewumi argues that age, not gender, is the basis of respect and privilege, and that anatomical features do not determine or necessitate gender roles and identities among the Oyo Yoruba. In other words, a man can be a husband or father to another woman. Furthermore, she contends that the differences between English and Yoruba linguistic terms used to describe persons highlight the cultural constructs of gender roles, as Yoruba has no equivalent for he, she, her, and him, but has equivalents for they and them, which do not reveal the gender of the persons being spoken about or referred to. If Yamadime and Nkiru Nzegu Nzegu's argument also align with Oyewumi's, as they posit that gender segregation and oppression of women in Africa are the results of Africa's colonial experience. However, Bibi Bakare Yusuf disagrees, contending that gender inequality in many African societies predates colonialism. Using examples from pre-colonial Yoruba practices, some of which are obsolete and some still extant, Bakare Yusuf argues that colonialism cannot bear the entire blame for gender segregation in contemporary Africa. I agree with Bakare Yusuf on this note. For instance, in the 16th century, Ajun, a woman entitled to the Oyo monarch's throne as the oldest and only adult child of a deceased king, was compelled to transgender before being crowned. This took place in an Oyo Yoruba pre-colonial kingdom. On the other hand, while patriarchy instituted some gender segregation in pre-colonial Africa, colonialism exacerbated the situation. Therefore, any attempt to redefine African thought and make it gender inclusive must take decolonization seriously. This makes gender studies in Africa a crucial part of the decolonization project. On the other hand, if one agrees with Oyewumi and other scholars who argue that African studies or African societies are fundamentally different from the way women are treated and that women's oppression in Africa was fundamentally absent in post-colonial Africa, the everyday lived experiences of women demonstrate that women and men are not equal in contemporary Africa. Therefore, the pursuit of gender egalitarianism is warranted regardless of its origin. Now, I move on now to consider Androcentrism in African philosophy. Throughout history, there have been examples of matriarchal societies. However, evidence suggests that women have predominantly suffered from oppression, marginalization, and subjugation in societies worldwide, making feminist movements crucial for gender equality and fair treatment of women. Academic disciplines have played a vital role in the emancipation of women, as they have been scrutinized for their inclusivity of women's issues and concerns. This has resulted in many disciplines re-examining their curricula and content, leading to changes in policies and governance to enhance equality and fairness for women. Philosophy as a critical discipline has also benefited from this scrutiny. The emergence of feminist philosophy has led to a more robust discipline, particularly in the Western world. Unfortunately, African philosophers have not engaged the discipline as much as they should in raising critical questions about egalitarianism and fairness, especially to women. This lack of engagement is due to the underrepresentation of women in African philosophy, perhaps, and also the dilemma of unsettling cultural ideas that have been held for centuries. However, as the African philosopher Peter Borduri once stated, similar to what Aristotle said about Plato, although our culture is dear to us, dearer still must be truth. While women scholars, humanists, feminists, and other scholars in African studies, sociology, literature, history, and political science have been asking questions about the marginalization of women, African philosophy has not raised many relevant questions. Despite some gains made in other African disciplines advocating fairness for women, the underrepresentation of women in important sectors, particularly in the economic and political spheres, remain prevalent, and much more must be done to enhance good gender relations in spheres of power. Therefore, it is imperative to scrutinize African philosophy through the parameter of gender, specifically by examining the theories, questions, and conclusions that have been drawn over the years. African philosophy can be defined in different ways, but one crucial aspect is to examine the trends and branches of African philosophy. According to Henry Odera Oruka, there are 6 trends or schools of thought that define African philosophy. These are ethno-philosophy, philosophic sagacity, nationalist ideological philosophy, professional philosophy, literary and artistic philosophy, and hermeneutical philosophy. Recently, in Nigeria, a Nigerian philosopher called Jonathan Chimakonam added a 7th trend called conversational philosophy. While other perspectives and trends in African philosophy exist, these 7 summarize the main arguments and issues in African philosophy. So I would now consider African philosophical schools of thought. I'll look at them through the lens of gender. Ethnophilosophy is a school of thought that asserts that pre-colonial African societies formed the foundation of genuine African philosophical ideas that are free from undue Western and Eurocentric influences. African philosophers who subscribe to this school of thought believe that defining African philosophy or determining its original content necessitates exploring the proverbs, sayings, folklore, songs, and riddles that existed in African cultures before their contact with the West. These cultural expressions reflect African identity and perspectives on self. While this approach has faced several objections, this presentation focuses on analyzing it from a gender perspective. Although many African proverbs teach valuable lessons on various topics such as hard work, morality, love, and togetherness, some proverbs extol male chauvinism and support gender inequality. Examples include proverbs like a woman's place is in the kitchen, a woman is a body, and the head of the household is the man, and so on, which are proverbs from different parts of Africa. And these sayings propagate the patriarchal notion that women are generally inferior to men and contradict the gender-inclusive nature of African philosophy, or the gender-inclusive goal of African philosophy. However, it is vital to note that proverbs, stories, songs, and folklore that contemporary Africans inherited from their ancestors form a crucial part of African identity. Consequently, it is necessary for African philosophers to critically examine and eliminate gender bias. One feminist African philosopher, Olayinka Oyeleye, is tackling this issue through the feminist post-proverbial approach. Oyeleye contends that it is possible to reformulate offensive proverbs to reflect the widely accepted position of non-discrimination and make them gender neutral without altering their intention or meaning. This strategy entails changing the name calling to gender neutral terms that convey the proverbs, that convey the problems the proverbs seek to warn against. For example, the Yoruba proverb Obìnrin lèṣù, obìnrin could be changed to a form that show that once somebody, but at the end of the day, it does not portray women in a bad light. Like the proverb, the female is a traitor, obìnrin lèké, obìnrin lọ̀dàlẹ̀. The female is a traitor, the female is a false person, can be reconstructed as humans are traitors, humans are false persons. It is essential for contemporary African philosophers, particularly feminist African philosophers, to address the gender segregation portrayed in many African traditional songs, sayings, proverbs, folklore, and folktales, to encourage and perpetuate the notion that the folktales that encourage and perpetuate the notion that women are inferior. This is a crucial task that they cannot afford to ignore if African philosophy is to be a gender-inclusive and robust discourse. The second trend in African philosophy emerged as a result of Oruka's critique of the ethno-philosophical approach. According to Oruka, the ethno-philosophical approach is premised on the assumption that there are no individual thinkers in Africa, thereby perpetuating the notion that Africans are incapable of philosophical thinking. To counter this assumption, Oruka embarked on his project called Philosophical Sagacity, which involved engaging African sages in conversations and documenting their philosophical ideas. Oruka faced criticism for his approach, with some objecting that he only focused on sages in rural areas, thus implying that only rural communities produce African sages. Oruka defended his approach, stating that he needed to engage sages free from Western and colonial influences. While Oruka addressed a significant criticism against his project, he overlooked a more fundamental objection. Oruka classified his interviewees into folk sages and philosophical sages. Philosophical sages were regarded as original independent thinkers whose thoughts were not influenced by either the West or their community. They are comparable to brilliant philosophers from the West. Folk sages, on the other hand, were wise people who possessed knowledge of cultural and traditional practices, but whose thinking was limited to practical experiences within their communities. Although highly respected, folk sages were not considered true philosophers. This classification raises concerns about the exclusion of women from the category of philosophical sages, as only one woman interviewed was classified as a folk sage. By this categorization, Oruka implied that African women are incapable of philosophical thinking. Oruka's project aimed to demonstrate that Africans are capable of philosophical thinking, but it appears to exclude women from this category. This exclusion undermines the goal of African philosophy, which should provide a platform for all Africans to contribute their unique perspectives and viewpoints to human discourse. The third trend in African philosophy emerged as a response to colonialism, which impacted every African community except for Ethiopia and Liberia. Intellectuals across Africa confronted colonialism with ideologies of liberation and freedom, contributing significantly to the independence movements of African states. However, Many of the nationalists who struggled against colonialism maintained patriarchal structures which were strengthened by the colonialists. Despite some advocating for gender equality and women's rights, many held conservative views about gender roles, leading to women's exclusion from active roles in political parties and government. This exclusion persists in African political circles today, reflecting the continuing challenge of gender disparity in Africa. The fourth school of thought is commonly referred to as professional African philosophy, which encompasses the ideas of African philosophers who have undergone formal training in Western philosophy within academic institutions. Although there may not be explicit efforts to exclude women from the sphere of African philosophy, the failure of many philosophy departments to decolonize the curriculum makes it difficult for women to see them as their intellectual homes. To address this issue, it is imperative to decolonize the curricula in Africa in philosophy departments, which will enable contemporary African philosophers to confront ideas and theories that propagate gender segregation and exclusion of women. Moreover, it is essential to reevaluate the components of African philosophy to determine how they incorporate or exclude women's issues and concerns in their primary arguments. This critical examination is the primary focus of the section dedicated to evaluating the content of African philosophy. That is the subsequent section. Furthermore, it is important to evaluate the content of African philosophy and redefine its components to ensure that they are inclusive of women's issues and concerns. This is particularly important when examining the hermeneutical school of African philosophy. This school holds that traditional sacred texts in African cultures contain the philosophical thoughts of the respective cultures. However, interpreting these texts requires a person who is familiar with the culture and possesses the required competence to interpret them accurately. The hermeneutical trend of African school of thoughts of African philosophy relies on professional philosophers to interpret these texts and considers such interpretation as African philosophy. However, this approach may serve to perpetuate biases and reinforce gender inequality. There are no hard and fast rules for engaging with or interpreting these texts, making them susceptible to erroneous interpretations and personal biases. If a scholar is not averse to gender inequality, they could impose their opinion on the interpretation, using the text to endorse women's oppression. Additionally, some of the traditional religions that these sacred texts originate from do not place men and women on the same social pedestal. Although the text may not advocate gender inequality, it is commonly believed, based on the cultures from which they emerge, that women are generally of lower status and are expected to assume roles that are less prominent than men's. In fact, some texts openly support the idea that women are inferior or evil. For example, the old Ifa literary corpus contains numerous stories of women's atrocities and many Ifa that warn men to be wary of women, although some support women and extol women's virtues. For a contemporary scholar who adopts the hermeneutic approach, the dilemma is how to address the biases against women in these texts without desecrating them, and invalidating their authority. Rewriting these texts completely is not a feasible solution. Thus, it is crucial to find ways to address these biases while retaining the text's cultural, spiritual, and historical significance. The literary and artistic school of thought in African philosophy examines the contribution of African literary writers to the development of African philosophical thought. Many African fiction writers use their works to showcase African culture, and since literature serves various purposes, including critiquing practices and beliefs, some African philosophers argue that literary works possess elements of philosophy and can be categorized as African philosophy. However, this approach to African philosophy presents challenges when viewed from a gender perspective. African literature has been dominated by male writers who have traditionally neglected women's issues and concerns. Renowned African novels and literary works also sometimes portray women as passive, weak, and subservient to men, perpetuating patriarchal ideals and traditional gender roles. Such works often focus excessively on the female body, reinforcing the notion that women are primarily emotional or somatic beings, while men are mostly rational and objective. Although women are now making their voices heard in the literary world, their contributions are still overshadowed by male voices. Consequently, the literary and artistic school of thought in African philosophy is inadequate for addressing gender biases prevalent in African philosophy. The conversational school of thought is the seventh school of thought in African philosophy, introduced by Chimakonam to establish a logical foundation for African philosophical inquiry. The conversational method is based on the Ezumezu logic, which provides a framework and guidelines for conversation, emphasizing the importance of context. In this approach, there are two parties to an African philosophical conversation: the Nwanju, who raises questions, and the Nwansa, who provides responses. Both parties engage in a conversation following the rules of Ezumezu logic, arriving at a functional synthesis from seemingly but not entirely opposed sub-contraries. Although the conversational method appears inclusive and attentive to everyone's concerns, it fails to address women's concerns because it overlooks power dynamics. The conversational method assumes that all parties are on equal footing and can engage in a conversation and reach a common ground without one party imposing its views on the other. However, women's marginalization, which is engendered and sustained by patriarchy, colonization, and other post-colonial oppressive structures, make it difficult for women's issues to be adequately addressed through this approach. Conversations are often dominated by those in positions of power, with their ideas and opinions imposed on the oppressed. Therefore, the conversational method is inadequate for addressing gender issues in African philosophy. So I move on now to evaluating the branches of African philosophy. African epistemology is a major branch of African philosophy that critically examines knowledge generation and its meaning from an African perspective. African epistemologists have attempted to define knowledge from African viewpoints and highlight the differences between these and Western perceptions of knowledge. However, a crucial aspect of this discourse has been largely ignored: how African indigenous knowledge systems contribute to the marginalization of women. For instance, the evaluation of knowledge generated by women based on their gender or the limited education provided to girls to prepare them for their perceived roles in marriage and motherhood are instances of gender inequality perpetrated by such systems. Proverbs, which serve as a repository of generated knowledge in African societies, also contain some instances of gender bias that place men above women in terms of knowledge acquisition and epistemic authority. African metaphysics, a subset of African philosophy, examines the nature of reality, existence, and being from an African perspective based on African culture, ontology, cosmology, and spirituality. While this field addresses many of the same questions as Western metaphysics, there are unique African metaphysical issues that have yet to be examined through the lens of gender inclusivity. Cultural, metaphysical, and spiritual beliefs and practices are often employed to justify gender inequality, which must be scrutinized and challenged within the context of African metaphysics. By acknowledging and addressing gender bias in African epistemology and metaphysics, we can move toward a more inclusive and equitable society that values the knowledge and contributions of all individuals, regardless of their gender. In African cosmology, there is a prevalent belief that humans possess metaphysical or spiritual powers that can have a physical impact on the terrestrial realm. However, this belief is gendered, with witchcraft being predominantly associated with women, while sorcery and herbalism are practiced by men. The spiritual powers wielded by men are generally perceived as beneficial, such as healing the sick, while those possessed by women, particularly witches, are considered dangerous and malevolent. This leads to the marginalization and oppression of women, with many being disowned and abandoned by family members or even killed on mere suspicions of witchcraft. Ancestral worship, another popular practice in many African cultures, also sidelines women as generational identities are traced through male ancestors, perpetuating patriarchal systems that value men over women. African ethics also exhibits gender-based disparities with different moral principles and expectations for men and women. For example, while chastity is highly valued, unmarried men are expected to remain virgins until marriage, while young men are not held to the same standard. Women are also expected to tolerate polygyny and display virtues of understanding and love, even when their husband takes another wife, while men are not required to show the same level of tolerance if their wife has sexual relations with another man. These ethical codes and injunctions may have been useful in organizing society in the past, but they now require scrutiny from feminist scholars to address their evident double standards. Additionally, African political philosophy requires gender scholarship to ensure that it's made a gender inclusive discourse. Women are underrepresented in politics, and this raises critical questions about fundamental political ideas and theories and their impact on participation and representation in politics. Addressing these disparities is crucial for creating a more equitable and just society in Africa. Many of the foundational political ideas that underpin politics and governance in Africa do not support gender parity in the political sphere. Historically, African communities, kingdoms, and empires organized their societies through monarchical forms of government, which often excluded women from entitlement to the throne, as mentioned earlier, even if they were the firstborn of a reigning monarch. So this exclusion stems from the belief that when a woman marries, she becomes a member of another household or family, and as such, is not entitled to the same rights and privileges as other members of that family, especially the men or males in that family. This mindset has persisted into the post-colonial era, where political power no longer rests with monarchs. The prevailing view has continued to contemporary Africa, and women are expected to prioritize their marriages over political ambitions. Another deterrent being that the political climate in many African countries remain volatile, violent, and intolerant of women who are often unable to match the violent tactics of male political actors. The intersection of African aesthetics and gender is another important area of exploration in African philosophy. African aesthetics examines how Africans express themselves through art, including paintings, music, dance, textiles, hairdos, sculptures, and cultural bodily marks. Since art is not neutral, it is important to ask whether the cultural artistic elements that have emerged from Africa have always been fair to women and whether they have been used to promote gender equity and inclusion. While aesthetics can evaluate concrete items, it is inappropriate to use blanket statements to describe artworks that emerge from a society or ethnic group. However, there are some sculpted works of art, for example, that reinforce gender stereotypes, emphasizing a part of the female body and perpetuating an unfair belief that puts women at a disadvantage. In many parts of Africa, beauty standards and expectations have largely curtailed women's freedom, as women are expected to adhere to stringent beauty regimens that can be detrimental to their health and time management. Nevertheless, society subtly coerces women to undergo inconvenient and time-consuming procedures in order to measure up to acceptable standards of beauty and aesthetics. Oh, so sorry. Yes, so I move on now to a gender-inclusive African philosophy as a decolonial discourse. African philosophy and decolonial studies have grown concurrently, and both fields address the fallout of colonization and the exigencies of decolonization in contemporary Africa. However, while African philosophy has addressed various decolonization issues, one burning issue that's not been mainstreamed is African women's emancipation from the colonial bequest of marginalization. Although women and men are not strictly equal in pre-colonial Africa, colonialism considerably widened the gap imposed by patriarchy through the public-private dichotomy and segregated gender role policies. In traditional African societies, before the advent of colonialism and its imposition of Victorian era ideals of dichotomizing the public and the domestic spheres, women were free to actively participate, especially in the economic sector. Pre-colonial African women were mainly merchants, artisans, and farmers who did not have to depend on their husbands for subsistence and wealth. However, this does not mean that pre-colonial African societies were perfect in terms of being characterized by gender equality. Gender disparity was notable in the political sphere due to traditional cultural beliefs and patriarchal structures that likely prevented women from being equal participants. The freedom that women had to be economically independent was significantly curtailed by colonialism. Colonial Africa witnessed a shift in the economic realm, where African indigenous vocations and professions lost their economic value and prestige, and there was an ascendancy of new professions introduced by the colonialists. These new professions emerged with new rules of qualification, taking education away from the family and impacting girls' and women's early access to Western education, leading to their late entry into some professions. Many women had to leave rural settlements to follow their husbands to big cities. But since many of them lacked Western education, they became full-time housewives or homemakers who were economically dependent on their husbands. Even in contemporary Africa, many women are forced to stay home and take care of their husbands and children, primarily because of cultural expectations. Due to economic challenges experienced in recent years in many parts of Africa, it is not feasible for families to depend solely on men's income, leading to more women entering into the workforce. However, in situations where the husband is rich enough to afford to take care of the needs of the family all alone, or in the case there is a conflict between a woman's paid employment and her marital or maternal roles, the paid employment must be sacrificed. Another fallout of the colonial experience is the marginalization that women suffer in the political realm. In colonial Africa, women were made almost invisible, and there was no reasonable representation of women in colonial governments. This problem has persisted to contemporary times, where it is believed that by many people that the political sphere is not meant for women. These are some of the practices that colonization introduced to African societies about gender relations, which must be challenged and abandoned if Africa must move past colonization and engage in a redefinition and retrieval of the continent. Therefore, gender balancing is a front burner issue that is required to be mainstreamed in African philosophy with a sense of urgency. An African philosophy that intends to achieve decolonization, or which intends to make significant contributions to the discourse on decolonization, cannot afford to sideline the issue of gender inclusiveness. So for too long, African philosophy has been studied and practiced without giving adequate attention to the importance of evolving it into a gender inclusive discourse. However, it is now more imperative and urgent than ever to do so. As Africa stands at the crossroads of redefining and repositioning itself to achieve decolonization and sustainable development, critiqued and tested ideas are necessary to achieve these goals. African philosophers have posed various thought-provoking questions, offered ideas that can move the continent forward, and have enriched global discussions by exploring issues of global concerns from their uniquely African perspectives. However, these ideas are incomplete without incorporating the perspectives of African women, who bring critical thinking and women's concerns to the table. This inclusion can ensure that African women are liberated from oppression and gender inequality, and that gender equality is achieved in contemporary Africa. In conclusion, the imperative of a gender-inclusive African philosophy cannot be overstated. It is essential for the continued growth and development of the continent, both in terms of achieving decolonization and sustainable development, as well as ensuring the liberation of African women by integrating the perspectives and concerns of African women into the discourse. This way, African philosophy can become a more comprehensive and nuanced field of study, offering valuable insights to global discussions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Epideola. It was a lovely presentation, very informative and insightful. I now give over to Prof. Makoni for our initial conversation.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. I want you to help me think through a couple of issues, and then we can proceed. As I was listening to your talk, I sort of framed it in two ways. There's a part I thought was dealing with African philosophy as an academic discipline. Then there is another part in which you were talking about African societies and how they are constructed, the role of gender in it. The two are obviously related, but let me, assuming that broad, rough framing is helpful, let me focus on African philosophy. Implicit in your argument, it appears, is a distinction that you are making between African philosophy and, let's say, philosophy in Africa. You're arguing for an academic discipline that is called, or which you want to call African, which is now called African philosophy. What is me is the following. It's not the debate about whether there is or there shouldn't be something called African philosophy, but is the uncritical endorsement of the beneficial effects of having something called a discipline. Right? I'm trying to argue, for example, that we must think about other ways of reconfiguring the intellectual activities that we do, which do not have to buy into the idea of a discipline as the ultimate legitimating force. Do you agree with me? Mm-hmm. That the problem is not African philosophy or philosophy in Africa. The problem is the idea of a discipline itself as the organizing principle of what we do, you, me, and everybody else in this, who is listening and taking part. Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe it is also important to have a discipline called African philosophy, because definitely Western philosophy is not focused on Africa as a continent, or on African people and issues that affect Africans. While it's presented as a global discourse, Western philosophy, well, when I started studying philosophy, we hardly hear Western philosophy, of course, Oriental philosophy, definitely. But it's like when I started studying philosophy, I was told this is philosophy. This is what it's like, this is the philosophy, something like that. But over time, studying philosophy for ourselves as Africans, we've been able to realize that some of the issues talked about in the global philosophy that we've been given, that we've inherited, that we've been presented with, do not really address issues and challenges that affect us as Africans. For example, part of our experiences, part of our history, things that have come to form our identity as a people. Unfortunately, for example, the issue of slavery, the issue of colonialism, these are issues that, unless we have our own we have our own discipline, it's not likely that mainstream Western philosophy is going to address some of these issues for us. And like I also mentioned when I started the presentation, some renowned Western philosophers actually argued against African people, against our humanity, rationality, our ability for critical thinking, and so on. So they argued, renowned philosophers, people who were who are known, that people that I started learning about their theories and ideas right from when, as soon as I started learning about philosophy or learning philosophy. People like Hegel, people like Kant, these are big names in Western philosophy. Yet they said some things about Africa that we need to confront, challenge, or otherwise those things they'll be taken to actually represent us, or to show the kind of people we are.
Yeah,
and this affects.
Yeah, I don't want to overdo this argument. I will move on to something else. The point I was simply trying to make, I think, was the problem that African philosophy is faced with, the problem that other disciplines are in, let's say, African history, African economics are faced with. It's not simply a problem about the Africanness of this. It's a problem that emerges partially because we unintentionally don't want to see how problematic the idea of a discipline itself is. In other words, what I'm arguing for is a way of thinking that says it's not only the philosophy that is problematic, it's the very idea of a discipline. And to say to ourselves, as we move forward, is it possible for us to reimagine a world in which we practice what we do, but which is not constrained by pre-existing disciplines? The notion of a discipline in itself, I think, is the fundamental problem here. That even if you have African philosophy, as long as it is framed as a discipline, it will carry with it certain legacies, certain limitations, which are inherently part of the way disciplines are defined in the Western academy. In other words, African philosophy, I would dare say, will never reach its full maturation within parameters called discipline. But anyway, that's not important. That's just, basically what I'm saying is the idea of a discipline itself is what is problematic. Anyway, let me move on to another issue that I was interested in as you went through. When you're talking about African philosophy and the debates between African philosophy, you cited a number of different female scholars who were dealing with this. And I'm just curious, are there any white women scholars who are contributing towards this debate on African philosophy and its intersection with gender? And if so, what arguments are they making?
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. The African philosophy as a discipline. Yes. Of course, there are many white feminist philosophers, but their focus, their focus has been on Western philosophy as a discipline, not on African philosophy. African philosophy, women, we don't have so many women in African philosophy.
Okay.
And that is why feminist African philosophy is a so to speak, a new discipline, or a recent offshoot of African philosophy. So I believe we are still working on it. There are many white feminist scholars, feminist philosophers whose focus who are focused on Western philosophy, but not on African philosophy.
Okay.
I did not know so many.
So many,
because even African philosophy itself is recent. It's not, is like I mentioned while presenting my paper, it's a recent discipline. And also, like Prof, you are not comfortable with creating a kind of straitjacket to...
No, don't worry about me. Don't worry about me. Don't worry. I'm just asking questions.
I understand that there are bound to be limitations as long as we go by the word discipline. But I believe issues that we are discussing are evolving. Definitely, it's going to get to a time that we're going to do away with this discipline, that discipline, putting ideas together under disciplines. But for now, and I believe it's part of the reason why multidisciplinary discourse and discourses are encouraged in academia. We are encouraged to do interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research. So definitely it's going to get to a time, but for now.
Yeah, because
it's nothing.
I don't want to overdo this, because you want to avoid what Lewis Gordon calls disciplinary decadence, where you just do this particular, oh, I'm doing this because that is what they do in African philosophy or in linguistics. But anyway, let me move on to something else. The other issue that I found very interesting in your presentation was the methodologically how you were handling African societies. Because in some cases, you'll be talking about pre-colonial Africa, then in other cases, let's say post-colonial Africa, then you're talking about different African societies. So the question that is there, given the diversity, range, and complexity of Africa as a society and Africa and its diasporas, if you were training somebody to think as an African philosopher, how would you teach them how to handle African material, given the fact that, let's say, the Yoruba society may be variable in itself, or there may be continuities within it, and it may differ from the Somali society or from the Shona society in Southern Africa. My question to you, which I want to get a sense from you, is methodologically, if you were to try and teach somebody how to think like an African philosopher, what do you what do you do? There is this young fellow or young lady who wants to follow your path. So they want to know, how do I philosophically begin to learn to think like you? How do I select what evidence to adopt and what evidence to disregard, given the complexity of the continent that we are dealing with? Right.
Well, I think you are right that we have different societies in Africa and different periods as well. Pre-colonial African societies, colonial African societies, post-colonial African societies with different cultures. Definitely anybody that is interested, that is why it is, I usually say it is not helpful to create to make blanket statements about Africa as a whole. However, anybody that wants to study African societies must, in my opinion, should select.
Okay.
And look at each society.
Okay.
What are like looking at them from the perspective of their history, their history, their culture, their beliefs or belief systems. So looking at it and using the method of criticality that philosophy has, which is a method that is popular in philosophy.
In
mainstream philosophy.
Okay. So methodologically, it would be like getting the students to learn how to analyze how individual, let's say, members of those African societies frame and understand what they're doing, their own internal perspectives about their own positions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
To understand how those people view themselves,
View themselves. Yes.
View themselves, what the people believe about themselves.
Yes.
Not what the scholar wants to impose on them, not
Okay.
what obtains elsewhere in other regions of the world.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So in terms of curriculum development, then if you were to sequence a series of courses which included African philosophy, you could begin with courses that looked at specific African societies or Africa generally, and then perhaps later on have a course in African philosophy, because by that time they will have a sense of contemporary and historical Africa. In other words, African philosophy has to be grounded in an acute awareness of African sociology and African history. Anyway, that's another way of framing it. Okay, now let me hand over to who is chairing Chanel? Is it Edwin?
Me.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. I have one question from Busi. She says, thank you for such an informative talk. I have to first apologize because I joined the talk rather late and missed some part of it. I heard you speak about the pronouns they, them. Can you kindly expand on the use of pronouns in relation to gender?
Yes, well, I mentioned this while discussing Professor Yewumi's position, and thankfully she's here. So yes, I read in one of our books, or so a couple of our books, and I also know, because I'm also Yoruba. In Yoruba, there is one or ho. These are pronouns in Yoruba. One or ho. One is used to refer to someone who is older. When someone is older, or in a situation where one is discussing with somebody, maybe having a formal conversation, one is used. And one is the same as like they, which is equally used to refer to many people in Yoruba. However, in English, one says he to refer to a man, or to talk about a man or a male. She, her, has, his, him. These are English pronouns that reveal the gender of the person that is being talked about, or being discussed, or being addressed. But in Yoruba, we do not have, Yoruba language does not have all these pronouns. When one says ho, it means that it's either you are familiar with the person you are talking to, or the person is younger. However, when one uses one, if I'm discussing, like if I discuss with Professor Yewumi now, she will talk to me and use o, because I'm much younger. Whereas it's in fact, I dare not say ho to her. I refer to her as one.
Because who? Do I look that old?
You are more. No, not you. You don't look old, ma, but you don't. Not at all. You do not look old, but you don't talk to your mother and say ho. You don't use ho for your mother. You use one for your mother. So that is Yoruba. And
Ronke, I think she's referring to your intellectual accomplishments.
So these are the differences between Yoruba and English, in English language. Yeah, yes. These are some of the differences, yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ipadeola. We don't have any questions in the chat, so please feel free to, I see Phoebe has a hand up. Phoebe, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this very wonderful presentation. My question, one of the things I loved was when you talked about the cosmological and spiritual legitimization we give for the social marginalization of women. And one of the things I kept wondering is, how do we narrow in the decolonial projects, how do we narrow the distance between this academic discourse and what's actually happening in the communities? Because I know that, I mean, this is very rich, like, and I can count how many women I know, how many families who are experiencing some of the things you're talking about, and how many women will push back hearing these things. And they'll push back because of some of the spiritual and cosmological legitimate reasons they will give you for why they should be in the position they're at. And so beginning to think about, you know, when we're talking about the interdisciplinary, you know, why we have disciplines, and how do we now reflect this back in the community? In your work and in your reflection on this, have you thought of, or how have you encountered sharing your work back in these communities? What has worked, or how have you encountered, how has your work been received back in the communities, if any? I was just interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's not that I've not thought about reaching out to the communities to address this issue of stigmatization and victimization of women in relation to the phenomenon of witchcraft. It's a real issue. Many, like I mentioned while presenting the seminar, many women have died as a result of this. Many have been maimed, many have been abandoned by their family members. And there is usually a kind of suspicion, especially in Africa, that this woman is a witch, especially if the person is an old woman. In most cases, old women are seen in that light, and many of them are avoided, abandoned. Family members that are supposed to take care of them end up leaving them aside as no. And it also causes real issues between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. So these are some of the issues. But as a matter of fact, to be honest, I've not had a seminar on this, like reaching out to our local communities to discuss this. I've not, but I've noted this. I'll work more on this. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott?
Sorry, thank you so much, Dr. Ipadeola. I have a kind of a question about this process of speaking back to Western philosophy. And my question, I suppose, is a little bit about the philosophical canon that we should be kind of like thinking about in terms of African philosophy. When I think about sort of the major response to Kant, for example, from you know, I think of Charles Mills. When I think of like who's responded to Hegel, it's like kind of Fanon and then Lewis Gordon. There does seem to be like a strong strand of kind of African response to the West coming from the Caribbean, the African diaspora, and also from lots of men. Like when I think about sort of, you know, African people working in an African philosophical tradition, I could also think of men in the United States who, like Olufemi Taiwo, for example, who speaks about kind of, you know, his roots in Africa and Nigeria and how they influence his philosophy, but does philosophy very much in kind of a Western kind of disciplinary tradition that Dr. Makoni is referring to. So who would be your canon? Who is doing good African feminist philosophy that we should be reading and engaging with? And how do you kind of draw those boundaries? Are we including the Caribbean? Are we including the diaspora? And how should we think about those things?
Yes, who are professional philosophers? Professional philosophers in Africa, somebody like like Louis Detroit is a good. We have so many of them. Is a good African feminist African philosopher to read. Also, Olayinka Oyeleye that I mentioned earlier on too is another professional philosopher who is equally a feminist. So, yes.
What about Oyeronke?
And Mama Oyewumi, Professor Oyewumi, definitely, I do not need to mention that name because she's well known. Her name is everywhere, so definitely. And I mentioned I mentioned the Bibi Bakari Yusuf too. I mentioned Nkiru Nzegu. I mentioned Ifi Amadime. These are African philosophers, the African feminist scholars that are written so well.
Thank you. As before, if anyone wants to ask a question, please go ahead. Just maybe a question of my own, Dr. Epideola. So you were speaking about proverbs and how there's been a move to change some of the ways in which you refer to gender in pronouns. I'm just wondering what has been the responses regarding these changes to proverbs? It can be in the academic community, or even larger than that. But I just want to know, because of the way in which people regard proverbs, what has been the responses to it?
Yes, the post-proverbial approach was introduced by Professor Aderemi Rajoelade, and Olayinka Oyeleye has adopted it, adding to address proverbs that are being unfair to African women. Of course, when such are presented in academia, in the academy, because there are intellectuals there that are able to also say, yes, it is true. These proverbs are not so fair, have not been so fair to women. They've been, these proverbs do not represent who women are or who they should be. The level of receiving those modified proverbs is higher, definitely in academia than in society, because people in society are going to say, well, many of them are likely to laugh it off. That are you trying to say our ancestors did not know what they were doing when they talked about those proverbs, when they gave us those proverbs, when they came up with those proverbs, that those proverbs must have been formulated because of what they experienced, what they saw, what they witnessed, and so on. However, I believe with persistence, it's going to get to everybody's knowledge eventually that some proverbs need to be modified. Some proverbs need to be looked at again. Some proverbs we cannot move forward as a society, as a people, if we do not take a second look at some of our proverbs that we inherited from our ancestors.
Thank you so much. Dr. Oyume?
On mute. Hello, everyone. I have something to say about proverbs and the way in which Dr. Ipadeola and some of the other people you've mentioned, the way you are looking at proverbs, if you allow me to say, is fundamentally flawed. Fundamentally flawed. What do I mean by that? Because some of us have written, you are treating proverbs as if there's a body of thought from 1,000 years ago, sitting there for people to now go, oh, my ancestors created this. That's not it. In fact, proverbs are constructed. Even as we are talking now, we may be constructing new proverbs. Proverbs are not timeless. And in my own work, and if you go to What Gender is Motherhood, I use the same argument for Ifa and Proverbs, is that these things are constructed in time. They are dynamic. And so you cannot use Proverbs as sources of evidence from so long ago and say, oh, this particular proverb, I'm sure it came into Yoruba society 2,000 years ago, so it proves this. Proverbs cannot, in and of themselves, prove anything. You can use them with other kinds of evidence to prove something, but Proverbs in and of themselves. And why do we say that? In Yoruba, even in Ifa, which is a system of indigenous thought, we have proverbs in Yoruba that talk about trains and railways and airplanes. And we know when those things came into effect. With regard to Ifa, which is a wonderful system of knowledge in Yoruba, one of the arguments I have made, and other people, about Ifa verses is that they were not all created at the same time, in the same place. For example, there's a whole chapter of Ifa that they call Oduimale. It's called the Muslim chapter. We know when Islam came into being, right? So you cannot use those kinds of things and say, oh, on the basis of this, they treat women like this, they said this about women. Of course, in racial societies, in patriarchal societies, whether it's the proverbs, whether it's the poems, or even novels that are developed, will be biased against what the society is biased against. So it's highly problematic to just pick up any proverb and say, oh, this proves this, this proves that. Even from English proverbs, we know they'll say, out of sight, out of mind. But there's another proverb that says, absence makes the heart grow fonder. That is the nature of what human beings create. So when somebody puts forth this proverb, I'm sure there are counter proverbs that somebody else is not putting forward. What I have found interesting with this kind of discussion is that if I were to do a study in Yoruba land today, I will gather, let's say 20 people and say, give me 5 proverbs each, right? That positivism. Give me 5 proverbs each. And if at the end of the day, of the 100 proverbs that this randomly selected people, if 80% of those proverbs are anti-women, right? And only 20% are anti-men, my conclusion necessarily is not that the society is more anti-women. There are layers of things you have to consider. Number one. Then number two, what it also says, and in my studies of colonization, this is one of the things that comes forth. Part of what also happened during the colonial period is that things that impinged on males in society, as they attained more power, as they attained more material resources, those things fell away. Many of the things that impinged on females, precisely because of their subordinated position in which they found themselves, right? You see, those things are heightened. So these are very complex issues. And one of the things I hardly wanted to comment on, but I saw that Marconi is dancing around the edges. It's like, what are your sources of evidence? You make all sorts of claims, but they are claims. And then if you are treating Africa as your unit of analysis, it becomes even highly problematic. Africa cannot be your unit of analysis. As you have monarchical societies, you have Igbo society, that they talk about Igbos as an egalitarian people. And if you look at Nkiru Nzegu's work, Ahmad Dume's work, and Kamene Okonjo's work, they talk about the dual sex system. If you look at the Akan, they have a matrilineal system. All those things are not accounted for. So I have very serious problems with use of evidence, or, to be candid, lack of evidence. These are claims and claims and claims and claims, unsubstantiated, if you would allow me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uyihume. Prof. Marconi wanted to follow, and then I'll go to Desmond.
Okay. I wanted to follow up this conversation. I was trying to avoid having to talk about my views about proverbs to get this discussion to another level. But I think let me do so now. There's a paper that we did, which is entitled Proverbial Futures, Proverbs and Political Discourse in Africa. And I think if I read the abstract, it captures the core of the argument we were making. Our objective was to analyze proverbs in African political discourses in light of integrational semiology and Southern theory. And this, I think, speaks to what Oyeronke was trying to say. And we find not fossils of ancient wisdom, but the creative construction of desired futures that may grow out of the present situation in light of what has been learned from the past. Proverbial discourses are always speaking to the present situation and commenting on available possibilities while being open, this is the most important thing, to multiple interpretations, and suggest an important argument, and this is important, about the provisional and contextual nature of all our knowledge, beginning with the assumption that each of us is in a better position to understand our own situation than any foreign observer or abstract schemata could ever be. We argue that the indeterminacy of creative proverbial discourse can present a better epistemological foundation for dealing with the uncertainties of natural events, social life, and the politics of freedom than the totalitarian discourses of proverbs as powers and theories of everything. We suggest that proverbial discourses, as they are practiced in Africa, are a way of thinking, but only a way of thinking contextually. That is the argument that we make. Then we later on move on in the paper to talk about the difficulties of actually defining what is a proverbial, what is a proverb, what is a formulaic expression, and the story goes on and on. Right.
Thanks, Prof. Marconi. Before I move to Desmond, Dr. Ipadeola, would you like to respond at this point, or would you like to take Desmond's question first?
Yes, I would like to respond. Yes, I'm aware that proverbs are dynamic, and they're also in a way contextual. However, my point is not that proverbs, that some African proverbs have been, and they will continue to be, or that they were formulated like some thousands of years ago, and they must be revered and remain, and they must be allowed to remain the way they are. I understand that as society progresses, people bring up proverbs, and some proverbs are recent, while some have been. However, my point is that proverbs, especially the popular ones, guide people's behavior, people's attitudes to certain issues, like the question of equality and other issues in African society. So those are the argument is not about the origin or the origin of those proverbs, or where they are from, since the period of time that they have been in use. The argument does not revolve around all of this. However, what we consider important in this work, what I consider important in this work, or what Oyeleye is trying to do, is to look at popular proverbs that guide people's behavior and reformulate them. Those ones that perpetuate gender inequality. Those ones that encourage disparity, to reformulate them. Those ones that reflect oppression and subjection, or suggest oppression and subjection in relation to women. The goal is to evaluate them and reformulate them, to reconstruct them, to make sure that those states, she intends to expunge the aspects that suggest oppression or that support oppression. So it is not really about the age of a particular proverb, but the influence it has on society, on people, on the way people think, the way people behave, the way people treat women. These are the issues that we are looking at, and that I believe Oyeleye is looking at. I find that, I found that important and instructive. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ipadeola. Let me just first read a question by, sorry, I think it's a question, comment by Victor, and then I'll go to Desmond. I subscribe to the argument that proverbs are dynamic. They are not necessarily static. Most of them, however, appeal to the localized culture-specific wisdom. They are resourceful in addressing localized matters. Most of them are metaphorical in nature and can therefore be explained using the lenses of modern theories, such as cognitive linguistics. It is important to take into consideration the context of use to comprehensively make sense of proverbs. Thank you. Desmond, over to you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ipadeola. I think there's so much brilliance in this house, so thank you, everyone. Before I go to the note I wanted to sort of wrestle with, Makoni's first question sort of got to the heart of my thinking as soon as I joined today's conversation on the question of African philosophy as a discipline. I think Phoebe's question, although it doesn't seem like it was addressing that, seemed to me like it was talking about that. And in many ways, I think also this question of how do we think of proverbs speak again to that particular issue. So a few thoughts, and to your notes, Dr. Oyomi, it's not just that proverbs are formulated in contexts. I think they are also used contextually. Mm-hmm. And I think that part is very important. In my personal experience, when I engage with people who don't function from a Western academic frame of mind, I'm talking about elders in the village and so forth. So imagine people who are not Western trained intellectuals. When they use proverbs, they deploy them within very specific conversational context to achieve particular goals. And sometimes if you were to sit long enough in a single conversation, you might hear the same person use mutually incompatible and contradictory proverbs in one conversation, right? And they believe all of that. It doesn't mean that they don't believe these proverbs. It's that proverbs are tools in that sense. The Igbos will say that proverbs are like the oil you use to eat your yam, right? So you have to figure out how large the chunk of yam you are eating to figure out how much salt, how much of the oil and all the other ingredients mixed in it that you want. So to think of proverbs as static or only just as something considered in context without even thinking about the ways that they are used, it just misses a whole lot. I had a professor in college, and by the way, my early academic background is in philosophy, in African philosophy for the most part. So Dr. Ipadeola, I agree with you in the ways that we inherit philosophy. It's this Western thing, and you are supposed to learn about them, so to speak. But I had a professor who became famous, won a lot of international awards by using African proverbs to attack African indigenous cultures. And I always felt unsettled by that. And I think the point I'm trying to highlight here is that even those who deploy proverbs in African philosophy are engaging in that contextual appropriation of proverbs to satisfy particular ends. You have those who are using them to say, hey, African, indigenous cultures are X, Y, Z, and then others who are using exactly African proverbs to do something completely different. So each person is selecting from a corpus what meets or what satisfies their interest in a particular context. So I think proverbs are a landmine. Each person that goes there just takes whatever they want. And I think we might miss that piece. Importantly. But of course, I think this speaks to the question of philosophy as a discipline. I think many African people who've engaged in that so-called great debate about whether African philosophy exists or not, are people who have learned philosophy in universities, who've been introduced to Western philosophy, and are trying to find images of Western philosophy in an African context. And for that reason, that debate itself and the entirety of what has come from it remain reactionary to Western philosophy. And you don't need to look at the content of what it addresses to figure this out. You need to look at its tools, its language, its audience. I think Phoebe's question about how African women who are not Western trained philosophers might respond to the argument about gender here is revealing, because in many occasions, they are not part of the conversation. They might not even know that that philosophic conversation is happening because they are not the audience of that disciplinary inquiry. So for that reason, the majority of that corpus of African philosophy is still an extension of European philosophic exercises. If African philosophy exists, and I do think it exists, whether we call it philosophy or not is a completely different question. Whether calling it philosophy constitutes it as a discipline is also another completely different question. And I don't know that there is any common space where that conversation is happening. The only thing is, I'm reminded of Wole Soyinka's use of the term tigritude, when he says, a tiger does not walk around the forests, beating its chest and saying, hey, I'm the tiger, you better respect me. When a tiger pounces on an animal and does what a tiger does, its tigritude becomes very evident. I'm thinking this is something most of us are familiar with. My sense is that if Africans are engaged in thinking, if they are having philosophic conversations, and whatever issues they are addressing, those are happening, and those who are capable of recognizing that probably will. It doesn't have to be carried through in the linguistic or logical tools that have for centuries defined Western philosophy. Let me say one last thing about this before I sort of wrap up in what my thoughts initially were. When I was in graduate school, I was doing my first master's degree in African philosophy in Nigeria. I had proposed a thesis to write my thesis on the use of African languages to philosophize. That is, that African philosophy ought to be in African languages. And this is sort of to your point, Dr. Ipadeola, that African philosophy should address the issues that are pertinent to the people, by the people primarily. Others can participate in it, but the people themselves do their thinking because human beings engage in thinking. And I recall proposing this to my advisor, who said, oh, that's a brilliant idea. However, actually, before I make this point, I had said that I'll propose this argument in English, but then I'll switch to Igbo, my African language, to complete the rest of the thesis. Because I said the argument I'm making is about philosophizing in African language, and I should show how that is possible. And my advisor says, yeah, that's a brilliant idea, but you have to write the thesis all in English because that's the official language of the university. And I refused to write that thesis. That was my very first act of protest against the institutional barriers, call it the disciplinary fixities of thinking that continues to haunt African thinkers, whose minds, I think, could still be deployed to a lot of the issues that are key. The practical concerns that are key to everyone are the kinds of questions that I think Phoebe is asking. And to my point then, I think many of you were here last week, I believe, when we had the conversation about, I think I'm trying to remember his name now, the African-American who was presenting also from philosophy. When I was asking the question about whether it is a viable approach to completely turn away from that reactionary pose, right? That is to refuse to speak to or explain one's thinking to the Western mind and just focus on the thing that Africans are doing. And I think the response then was, yeah, that might seem like it's a cool idea, but you still need to understand how the Western mind functions to be able to respond to it. So there is value in engaging with the Western mind. I see that as a bit of a tension because there is a force, there's an intellectual force in refusing to engage with that which was designed to oppress. I think that is an act of liberation by itself. Yet, if the material conditions of that thinking continues to oppress, you probably would be wise to also understand how that system is designed. And I think that tension remains for me. The only thing, and this is how I'm sort of beginning to resolve this in my mind, and hopefully Dr. Ipadeola and others, you can weigh in on this, is that it is possible, and perhaps it's actually the case, that most Africans who engage philosophically or otherwise, who do so outside of the Western intellectual traditions, are wrestling with issues of coloniality. That is the fact that someone thinks as an African without engaging in African philosophy or Western philosophy. That someone is, so-called indigenous African thinker does not mean they abandon the forces of coloniality or that they are unconcerned with issues of colonial oppression. I think it is very possible for someone to engage in deep philosophical inquiry, sociological inquiry, political action, so forth, that engages with coloniality, engages with Europe without having gotten a PhD from a university or working as a professor in an academic institution. There might be a strategic and epistemic flaw in assuming that the only way to engage Western thinking or Western political traditions that seek to obscure every other is to engage with it in its own terms or on its own terms, to use its tools, its methods, its approach, its language to engage in that thought. And I think that probably ignores the forcefulness of what is happening otherwise. I hope this makes sense, but I'm wondering if that solution, that sort of that third way, that middle ground is a useful way to think about alternatives to being entrapped in Western intellectual discourse as a way to continue to engage with it in decolonial practices, or to abandon it completely and do something else that one considers African. Thank you.
Dr. Ipadeola?
Oh, thank you very much. I believe what Dr. Odugu has said is similar to what Henry Odera-Ruka did. He went to rural communities to interview African sages. I mentioned this. and he documented their philosophical perspectives, their thoughts. These were people who never had any contact with Western philosophy, with Western ideas. And if one would see that these people, they were, I mean, they are philosophers in their own right. So that is possible, and that is being done. After Odera Oruka, other philosophers, contemporary philosophers have also started employing that method. So it is possible. With regard to the issue of language, of the linguistic parts, the issue of the language of discourse that we employ as African scholars, as African philosophers, this is problematic because this Ngugi wa Thiong'o has been an advocate of this, that African scholarship should be done in African languages. But the problem of understanding what an African scholar does is going to be a challenge, really. But I believe we should continue. We should start from somewhere. Like you said, I also agree that as African scholars, it is imperative, it is important for us to make use of what is available to us from our standpoint as Africans. We have to start from somewhere, but it's not going to be easy, really. So also it appears. But I agree that it is important for us to interrogate Western ideas without really trying to prove anything, without trying to show how that we are also intellectuals, or we are also thinkers or philosophers. Yes.
Thank you. Anissa?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ipadeola, for your detailed research, very comprehensive, and thanks for sharing it with us today. When I look at African philosophy, I mean, I'm looking at, it's not just African philosophy, philosophy in general. I divide it into two things. There's a kind of need-based philosophy where people take a probe into something, research, methodologies are involved, and almost a kind of philosophy is created. Whereas there's another kind of philosophy, and I refer to things like, the African philosophy of Ubuntu, where it's experiential, it's more wisdom related, it involves phenomenology. And then there's this other philosophy where there's research, data, taking probes, and both are relevant. But I think that in African philosophy, we cannot undermine the role of the philosophy that is wisdom-based. That comes from a wide human experience.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for example, if we look at, Proverbs was a very interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your contribution to that. But I mean, it's very much a question of choice. When you take a probe into something, it's contextual, it's where you are, it's how you feel about it. You can look at a proverb, like an African proverb that says, when you educate a man, you educate an individual. When you educate a woman, you educate a generation. Now, that embraces the wealth of women, but then working on in a different context, you would overlook that proverb and see something like, something that demeans women. So I think it's all very much, I'm very, very suspicious of facts and findings. I think everything has a perspective. And it's all time-based, situation, individual. Philosophy is a marvelous subject, but it's expansive.
Thanks so much, Anissa. Dr. Ipadeola, I'm not sure if you want to respond, but there's one more question also in the chat. So if you would like to first respond to Anissa, that is okay, and we can then move to the last question.
Yes, you're right. It depends on one's perspective. I would have mentioned that, yes, there are African proverbs that celebrate women, especially mothers. I have that in another word, yes, that celebrates women, especially women who are mothers. Mothers in most cases are celebrated in African societies with African proverbs, definitely. But at the same time, that does not mean we should overlook those ones that demean women. The goal is to, or the aim is to look at those ones that celebrate women, that celebrate our mothers, that celebrate women as mothers. But at the same time, to review those ones that demean women, those ones that contribute to the marginalization of women. It is equally important. While it is true that for a researcher that is working on a particular subject, the researcher is likely going to look at, like I'm working on the issue of the marginalization of women, I'm likely going to look at proverbs that reflect this, that suggest this, that corroborates, that strengthen this problem, this issue. At the same time, it does not mean that I am denying the fact that there are other proverbs that are good, that celebrate women, that extol their virtues. The issue is why those ones are there. Those ones that are not good should be reviewed, should be looked at again with the hope of making them good, because anyone that is also in reality, anyone that is also going to perpetuate or that is going to marginalize a woman is not going to look at those ones that are good. The person is likely going to use, because like it's been mentioned already, which I agree with this, that proverbs are contextual. So in a particular context that someone intends to do something against a woman, to marginalize a woman, they are going to look for those proverbs that support that. They are not going to look for proverbs that celebrate women, that extol women's virtues. They are going to look for those proverbs that support what they are about, what they are doing. So that is why it is important to evaluate those proverbs that are not good. While those ones that are good are okay, those ones that are not good should also be reviewed and evaluated. Yeah.
Would it be important to look at when in Africa, when the woman is celebrated and when the woman is demeaned? Because I mean, I was born in Africa and brought up there, and I saw so much looking up to women, you know, the mother, the grandmother. The fathers were hardly ever revered the way mothers and grandmothers were.
Yes, as mothers, really, in most cases, in many African cultures, mothers are celebrated, mothers are looked up to. Many of these proverbs show that mothers should be respected and celebrated. But when a woman is just a woman, not a mother, in some instances too, there are proverbs that say mean things about women. And these are the ones we have issues with, not the ones that celebrate mothers and or women as mothers.
Thank you. Okay, one last question. I'm not sure if it's a question or more of a comment or a kind of a hybrid. Sibusise Cliff Ndlangamandla says, I believe we all do philosophy. Is philosophy a discipline? Sibusise Cliff, if you would like to elaborate on that, you are welcome to.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that if the issue is the oppression of women or is an inequality or gender, then there are other things happening there that are oppressive and not just attacking or isolating language, maybe proverbs, so to say. So that was the one point, and I think it has already been made here. But also on a trivial note, the philosophy as a discipline, I'm not, of course, that was a question that Makoni was touching on in the beginning. But it's not just to say African philosophy as a discipline, but whether indeed thinking about a discipline of philosophy isolated from other issues or arguments that we make, it does any good or any justice, because I'm just worried. I'm just thinking that perhaps the whole notion of a philosophy department is not necessarily of use, or maybe, or I mean, not say department, but a discipline is not necessarily. I'm not saying I'm attacking the speaker, I mean, or discrediting her position, but perhaps it's no longer, it is not doing much service to our interest in the academy. Thanks.
I will now also take Unyeri's hand, and then Dr. Ipadeola can respond maybe for those two last questions, and then we can close the session.
Yes, Dr. Ipadeola, thank you so much for this very interesting and rich presentation on African philosophy with the feminist dimension added to that. So many things, so many thoughts, so many comments, so many points have been made. And I really don't know where to start from, but I just want to say that this reminds me of a conversation I had so many years ago with a significant other as to whether there was such a thing as an African philosophy or not. And his argument was that there was nothing like that. And my argument was the contrary, that we had, that we do have what we can call an African philosophy. And just because certain things were not written down or we didn't have a written culture does not mean that we didn't have a philosophy. Because he had this inclination to what he called philosophy had to do with, Western thoughts, Western philosophers and all that. And, so it reminded me of that argument. Concerning the issue of Proverbs, I think we have sort of maybe overflogged it somehow, and maybe made it, put it up on a pedestal that was not originally intended. But I'm not saying it's not important. But we have to, I think the issue here is on the use of the Proverbs, perhaps more than on when they originated, because I know that when people talk and they want to insert Proverbs into their conversations, they would say, oh, our forefathers used to say. Our forefathers used to say A, B, C, and D, and then they'll insert the proverb there. Of course, remember, they never said our mothers or foremothers. Never heard that. I've never heard somebody say, oh, our foremothers used to say. It's always the forefathers used to say, and in that expression, I can tell you very much that women are not included, or were not included. And most of the proverbs, if you probably go back and look at their origins, came from men. All right. And so a proverb that originated in a particular context 1,000 years ago, it can still be applied now. And many of those proverbs are still being applied without any consideration for review or anything like that. I remember visiting a person who had invited me and some other, and this was back in Nigeria, and I was the only female among the visitors who were invited. The other woman among us was his fiancée. So when we got to his house, he had the audacity to use a proverb and tell me why I should be in the kitchen cooking for them, the men who were sitting in the living room. And I pushed back and said, well, you have a fiancée, she's doing what she should be doing in the kitchen, and I am your visitor. So you don't expect me to walk into your kitchen and cook for you or cook for everybody. I am a visitor in the same way as these other men are visitors, to your house. So I sat down, I didn't go anywhere. And I felt very, insulted by that. And he used a proverb to sort of show me, try to tell me where my place was, even in his own home. So while proverbs are dynamic and, contextual, whether we're thinking of 1,000 years ago or presently, we have to look more at the way that they're being used. And it is true, I'm going to agree with the presenter that those proverbs that demean women are or were indicative of the attitude of the society towards women at that time, because after all, what are proverbs reflective of? They only reflect the worldview of that society at that time and so on. And if those proverbs are still being used now, it means that certain people still have that worldview 1,000 years after. So we have to look at those proverbs in that sense. That's what I want to say about proverbs. Now, the other thing I wanted to say was that I agree also with the presenter that the African society was not that egalitarian before colonialism. We all know that, but sometimes we tend to romanticize that society and bring up the egalitarian issues as if men and women were equal and so on and so forth. And we know that they were not. All right. Yes, women had certain rights in the pre-colonial times that were taken away from them during colonialism, but that does not mean that they were equal to men. And the fact that the mother or the mother figure is venerated, is respected, and so on, does not necessarily mean that all women are treated that way. I remember teaching in a university in Nigeria, and a discussion came up, and one of my students, an Igbo student, to emphasize it, said, "Oh, women don't have brains." To me, in the classroom, and I was teaching him. So I said, do you know that that includes your mother? When I mentioned that, he looked at me. You needed to have seen the expression on his face, because he didn't think that he was connecting his mother to that statement. So he separated his mother from the statement about women, that women didn't have brains. I said, how can you say that sort of thing? Your mother is a woman, So these things still exist, and we need to address them, which I think is the point that the presenter is making. We need to address these things and change, find a way to change the thinking, and that women shouldn't be seen in that light anymore. Because just because a proverb originated 10,000 years ago does not mean it's still not being used now as a way to make some negative gender differences, So we have to be very careful with that. And the other thing I wanted to say as well is there was a question or something, I think it was a comment by Makoni about, I think your research methodology, if you were going to, investigate philosophy. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but if you were going to investigate African philosophy, that you would have to take into consideration that there are different African societies, and, the philosophical thinking may vary from place to place and so on and so forth. Yes, agreed. And then I think the presenter said, yes, that if someone was studying African philosophy, he or she would need to take that those contextual differences into consideration. I sort of thought that, okay, does that mean that there are no universals in African philosophy? what we call Western philosophy today is made up of universals. I am sure that if you go into individual societies in Europe or in the Western world, you're going to find some differences from place to place. But then we have this whole concept of universals, or of a universal Western philosophy. Why can't we have that as far as African philosophy is concerned? Even if we're looking at different, societies in Africa and their ways of thinking, I am sure we're going to find universals that we can, co-opt into what we may call African philosophy, while being aware of the differences. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Unyeri. Okay, Unyeri just opened up a whole new debate. So
let me respond. Let me respond to a couple of things. I want to start off with the universal things. I was not suggesting that there are no commonalities across African societies. That was not my argument. I indeed draw distinction between two types of universals. What I call imperial universals. These imperial universals assume that what is true of one society or one group of people at a particular point in time is true of everybody else. That I object to. What I support is what I call bottom-up, charitable, egalitarian universals. These are the universals that come up from what we commonly have as individuals belonging to different societies. So I was signaling my own, I was trying to move away from the imperial universals where this is true of me, so it must be true of everybody else. I wasn't saying that there are no commonalities and that methodologically we can't move towards charitable bottom-up universals, not at all. All scholarship to some extent aspires towards some form of universals as we pull together and bring together all the different types of knowledges that we have. That's what I think I was trying to talk about. On the issue of proverbs, for me, if I'm cornered, I draw the following distinction. To talk about proverbs is one thing. To talk about how proverbs are used is another thing altogether. And what has tended to happen in this discussion is the conflating of proverbs and how they are used. If I'm in a class, I would insist that that distinction is important. How you use the proverb, right, is important because proverbs are useful in terms of the uses to which they are put. And they may be put to completely contradictory functions, right? But use is the critical aspect, no issue that must be attached to the idea of what? Of proverb. That is if we know what a proverb is, right? But anyway, that's what I meant. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. Yes, there will be certain relics that come from different parts of the world, that I agree. But it's the use to which they are put. The same proverb may be used now differently from the way it was used in some time in the past. That is, I try and resolve that by focusing, by hinging my argument on the use of proverb. Right, anyway.
Thanks, Prof. Makoni. Okay, I'm going to use my powers to rein you in. Okay. 2 minutes, and then we need to close.
Okay.
You can go, Desmond. You're muted.
Oh, thank you. So did you say 2 minutes?
Yes.
I'll try. Okay. Unyeri, thank you so much for those very brilliant comments. I appreciate that you raised some of these issues because they sort of are at the heart of the conversation. So 2 quick things, and these are in some ways in addition to what Makoni has already said. My sense is that there are few people who would look at people's experiences on the continent today, in the last decade, couple of decades, who would have any illusion about the fact that women are not just oppressed, but are victims of violence in many ways, that are defined by gender. There is absolutely no question, in my view, about that, because I grew up on the continent. That is the problem I think many of us are trying to solve. That's something one can identify as a problem. The difficulty is that the definition of the geography of that problem, the source of that problem, has often been blamed on African traditions, African history. But the anthropological work we have in hand, including the linguistic analysis that I think Dr. Ipadeola was making earlier, suggests that it might not be an accurate step. That is, blaming African traditions probably is not accurate. Imperialism might be responsible. And this is to Makoni's point. The reason Africans became reactionary, the reason we constructed the thing we call African philosophy, was that some European, after drinking whatever intellectual Kool-Aid they drank, showed up on the continent and said, hey, you people are not humans. Why? Because you don't have philosophy, you don't have religion, you don't have culture, you don't have history, and so on and so forth. And ever since, Africans have been trying to prove themselves by saying, yes, we do have history that is similar to yours. We do have philosophy that's similar to yours. We do have universals that's similar to yours. Here they are, right? It's that propping up of some ossified, mummified something from the past that we don't often question carefully, including those that excavate things that we call proverbs, that is at the heart of the issue. They have not been very well equipped to engage with the issue. We think we are engaging with the issue by trying to mimic Europeans, but we probably will not go very far in trying to solve those issues. So if anybody was trying to use proverbs to enter into that conversation, my sense is the person would be wise to understand, like Makoni was saying, how are proverbs constructed in context and how are they deployed for various ends in a particular context. And once you do that, you recognize that you cannot characterize any single society, let alone the entire Africa, on the basis of any proverbial position. You cannot just say, because this proverb exists, then this is the way any people are. At any particular time in history, it will become impossible to do that simply because one person in that particular context uses one proverb to do one thing, uses a contradictory proverb to do a completely different thing. So proverbs are that fungible, they are that dynamic and malleable. So instead of trying to prop up something that we hope would be redemptive in the face of this, I think it would be actually more, it would be more helpful for us to attempt to recognize that Africa was not what Europe thought. So when you say, for instance, that we all know that Africa was, that indeed pre-colonial Africa was not egalitarian, I don't know that. I know Europeans said that it was not. I have not had enough evidence to know for a fact that pre-colonial Africa was not egalitarian. That's what we're trying to figure out. The much we know so far suggests that there is a lot of egalitarianism in that context, even if it was not perfectly egalitarian. There is enough egalitarianism in that context for me to say to my own daughters or to any woman around me, look to African traditions for inspiration to change or redress what Europe has destroyed. I think that's really at the core of all of this. I think I'm probably at 2 minutes.
And if I can just add to that, a few seconds, please. I can also say that you don't know that the society was egalitarian. I can also say that you don't know.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah, that it was egalitarian. And then when you say you're going to tell your daughters to look to African traditions, which ones are you talking about? Because when they look around themselves, they see traditions that oppress them, traditions that say that they are less than. So which traditions are you telling them to look to? And I think you made a comment the last time we had this forum last week about modern day African women who are looking to the West to solve problems, that are sort of affecting women. In other words, anti-women issues. So women, African feminists are looking to the Western world. Okay, why shouldn't they do so? if they look around them, they don't see anything that remotely shows them that they need to look inwards. So they look around it. For example, I am the first daughter in my family. I cannot inherit anything. When my father died, I was asked to give a cow, give this, give that, and so on and so forth. But his property, none of it came to me, none. It was my brother, or it is my brother, who's 4 years my junior, who has possession of his property. Yet, I was asked to give this, give that, do this, do that. I did nothing. And if you are married as a woman, because the argument they make is, oh yeah, if you go, you'll be married off and you go to your husband's house and blah, blah, blah. You can't even inherit in your husband's house as well. So inheritance is an issue when it comes to women in many societies. So what are you going to say to your daughters? You turn around and you say, oh, okay, yeah, look to African traditions. Some African traditions tell them, sorry, you can't inherit your father's property. So where exactly are they going to look?
Yeah, but inheritance is not only an issue for women. Inheritance is an issue for everybody. I won't inherit anything when my father dies because he got married and he's got other sons, right? And so the issue here is not that inheritance is an issue to one particular gender. It's an issue to everybody, right?
I'm sorry to disagree, Makoni. It is more of a women's issue than a man's issue.
But it is an issue for them as well.
I'm not saying it's not, but it's more of the woman's issue because she gets nothing. She gets nothing. But whereas at least some of the men in the family, if not all of them, who get it. My two brothers are the ones, in charge of my father's property. They are the ones it has gone to. None of us, the girls, have anything. And it's not just my family, so it's not an individual thing. It's what happens in the society. Except you have some exceptions where some modern thinking parents have decided, okay, listen, we're going to sort of do away with some of those traditional things and we're going to share property, among the girls as well, or among the females in the family as well. So it is an issue, maybe not where you come from, maybe in other places, but, generally speaking, who is more likely to inherit something? It is the male in the family who is more likely to inherit the property of the father. So that's what I'm saying. So inheritance is a woman's issue as well. Or more a woman's issue. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much, Unyere, for the very needed perspective as well. I will now give the last word to Dr. Ipadeola.
Oh. On this note, so much has been said. I'd like to say thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for making this an exciting session. Thank you for the insightful contributions. And also, I'd like to say, yes, these are some of the issues that will continue to engage as Africans. I agree that definitely, if we look at our different African cultures, there are still issues to be addressed. There are still questions to be asked because there are so many practices, some beliefs that actually marginalize women. We need to tell ourselves the truth. So we continue to engage these as scholars, and like I pointed out in my book that Dr. Van der Merwe mentioned earlier on, there's a connection. There's this connection between episteme and doxa, that is between the academy and the larger society. So we'll continue to interrogate these ideas and hopefully we'll move on as Africans. Thank you very much once again for having me. I am grateful to be here. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much for being willing to share your time with us, Dr. Ipadeola. We really and sincerely appreciate that. I now give over to Vishnu, I think, to announce the speaker for next week.